The chandelier above the Huntington ballroom held 3,000 crystals, and Alissa E. Barrett had counted every one during the 17 seconds of silence that followed the Duke's accusation. Not the silence of polite attention, not the hush that precedes applause, but the silence that belongs to executions and catastrophes, the kind that announces to everyone present that they are witnessing someone's destruction in real time. This woman, Edward D. Kessner's voice cut through the waltz like a blade through silk, and each syllable carried the weight of 3 centuries of inherited authority, is a calculating deceiver who has attempted to ensnare my brother through the oldest and most despicable of feminine arts. The words hung in the air between them. Between Alissa and the 300 faces that had turned toward her, some shocked, some delighted at the spectacle, all hungry for her response. At 25, Alissa knew which doors in London opened to merchants' daughters, which drawing rooms tolerated new money but never quite welcomed it, which smiles concealed the unspoken boundary between acceptance and belonging. But she had never heard her name, the name she'd spent 5 years teaching society to speak with respect, transformed into something obscene, spoken as though it represented everything decent people should despise. She stood frozen in her purple gown with its gold embroidery, one gloved hand still resting on Lord Philip Kessner's arm, the other suspended mid-gesture. Through the massive windows, the gas-lit streets of Mayfair glowed with the prosperity of people who belonged somewhere, whose reputations were inheritances rather than achievements, whose worth was confirmed at birth rather than questioned at every ballroom. Alissa had never truly belonged anywhere. She was merely the merchant's daughter who'd learned to move through aristocratic spaces, the woman who said the right things but was never quite right herself, accomplished enough to invite, forgettable enough to exclude when it mattered. The Duke stood in the center of the parquet floor, his green velvet coat seeming to glow with righteous authority, his dark eyes fixed on her with contempt that needed no justification beyond his title. In his hands he held nothing, no evidence, no proof, because men like Edward D. Kessner didn't require proof. His word carried the weight of half of Derbyshire, and in this room, in this moment, his certainty was the only truth that mattered. "I have letters," he continued, his voice dropping to a register that forced the room into deeper silence, "that prove Miss Barrett pursued my brother with mercenary calculation, exploiting his idealism and his kindness." Alissa's breath stopped. Letters. Her heart struck once against her ribs, hard, accusatory, as if she'd committed some unforgivable transgression by daring to be courted by a duke's brother. Then it seemed to halt entirely, suspended in the thick silence of expensive perfume and barely concealed satisfaction, because dukes did not destroy reputations at the season's most important ball unless they wanted something more than justice. And no one fabricated scandals about women who'd spent 5 years perfecting the art of being acceptable unless there was a reason that had nothing to do with protecting brothers and everything to do with protecting power. If you love stories where destroyed women become architects of their own vindication, where scandal becomes the foundation of systemic change, and where revenge demands we dismantle the rules that allowed the injury in the first place, stay with Alissa's journey. This is not a story of forgiveness, it's a story of transformation. Alissa E. Barrett did not know she was about to be destroyed. She knew only what 5 years of calculated social climbing had taught her. That acceptance was possible if you were clever enough, graceful enough, useful enough to the right people. She had grown up in her father's textile manufactory, learning commerce from account books and innovation from necessity, watching James Barrett transform raw ambition into undeniable wealth. At 16, she'd hired tutors to eliminate the merchant class inflections from her speech. By 20, She could navigate a formal dinner with the precision of someone born to it, distinguishing between 12 types of forks and knowing exactly which topics enlivened conversation without crossing into vulgarity. She had no title, no aristocratic lineage, no confirmation that her presence at the Huntington ball registered as anything more than tolerated novelty. Her only inheritance was the knowledge of how to be valuable, how to contribute rather than demand, how to earn space in rooms that had never been designed to include her. But value, she was learning, could be rewritten as threat in a single sentence. Contribution could become scheming. Earning could become seduction. And all the careful architecture she'd built over 5 years could be demolished in 17 seconds. Alissa had spent 3 months courting Lord Philip Kestner, or rather, allowing herself to be courted by him, because their connection had been genuine, built on shared frustration with inherited privilege and mutual dreams of reform. She'd believed that Philip's idealism and her practical knowledge could create something meaningful, that marriage could be both strategic advancement and authentic partnership. She hadn't known about the clause in the Duchess of Ravenscourt's will, hadn't known that Philip's marriage to a woman of good character and independent means would trigger the division of the family fortune, breaking Edward's absolute control over the Kestner wealth, hadn't known that Edward would rather destroy her than share power with his brother. Now she descended from the dance floor with measured steps, not fleeing, not yet, because fleeing would confirm guilt. Her pulse beating a rhythm foreign to the 5 years of practiced composure. This wasn't fear, exactly. Fear was a luxury for women who had alternatives. This was the recognition that everything she'd built could be taken by someone who'd built nothing, inherited everything, and wielded his birthright like a divine weapon. The crowd parted for her as she moved toward the ballroom doors, not out of respect but to avoid contamination, as if scandal were contagious and proximity might taint reputations by association. She caught glimpses of faces she'd laughed with over tea last week, women who'd praised her embroidery and asked for her father's business advice, men who'd solicited her opinions on literature and reform. None of them met her eyes now. Alissa stepped into the cool March air of the terrace, alone except for the sound of renewed conversation behind her. 300 voices dissecting what had just happened, determining whether the Duke's accusation carried enough weight to justify permanent exile or merely required a season of absence. She looked back through the ballroom windows at the glittering assembly, at Edward D. Kestner accepting congratulations from older men who valued decisive action, at Philip standing frozen where she'd left him, at the chandelier that still held its 3,000 crystals and would continue glittering long after her name became cautionary tale. She had spent 5 years climbing toward acceptance. The Duke had taken 17 seconds to push her off the summit. What Alissa did not do in that moment was weep, though tears would have been understandable, perhaps even strategically useful. What she did not do was flee to the countryside, though absence might have allowed the scandal to fade from immediate memory. What Alissa E. Barrett did was smile. Not with warmth, not with forgiveness, but with the cold recognition that Edward D. Kestner had just made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had destroyed her reputation in the world that mattered to him. She would destroy the world that allowed him to wield destruction so carelessly, and she would do it not by begging for restoration, not by proving her innocence to people invested in her guilt, but by building something new, something where power had to be earned rather than inherited, where accusations required evidence rather than titles, where women like her didn't need permission to exist in rooms that had always been designed to exclude them. The game Edward thought he'd won was just beginning, and Alissa had just learned that she'd been playing the wrong game all along. Alissa woke to the sound of calling cards being removed from the silver tray in the entrance hall. Not delivered. Withdrawn. She recognized the particular metallic scrape of the butler's discretion, the careful silence that announced catastrophe without requiring words. Sunlight cut through the damask curtains of her bedroom in her father's Belgrave Square townhouse, illuminating dust motes that drifted with the same indifference the world would now show her. 23 calling cards had rested on that tray yesterday morning, representing tea invitations, charity committee meetings, musicale appointments. By the time she descended the staircase in her dressing gown, she knew none would remain. The scandal sheets lay spread across the breakfast table like casualties of war. Her father hadn't hidden them, which meant he wanted her to see exactly what she faced. The Morning Chronicle led with a headline that managed to avoid libel while destroying her completely. Scene at Huntington Ball raises questions of propriety. The Gazette was less careful. Merchant's daughter accused of mercenary designs on noble family. Her name appeared 17 times across 4 publications. Not Miss Barrett, not even Miss A. Barrett, but Alissa E. Barrett in full, as if the scandal required her complete identification, as if future daughters needed to know precisely whom to avoid becoming. James Barrett sat at the head of the table, his coffee untouched, his morning correspondence abandoned. He'd built an empire from 2 looms and relentless innovation, survived competitors who'd tried to bankrupt him, and workers who'd tried to burn his factories. But watching his daughter's reputation incinerated in print was a type of helplessness he'd never encountered. "I've made arrangements," he said, and his voice carried the same careful control he used in business negotiations he was losing. "We can leave for the continent by week's end. Florence, perhaps, or Vienna, somewhere the English papers don't follow quite so quickly." Alissa poured tea with steady hands, watched the amber liquid fill bone china painted with roses. Exile, the traditional solution for ruined women. Disappear long enough for memory to fade. Return years later as someone vaguely scandalous but no longer immediate entertainment. "No," she said. Her father's expression shifted from grief to confusion to something approaching fear, because he knew his daughter well enough to recognize the tone she'd inherited from him, the one that preceded decisions that changed everything. "Alissa, you don't understand what this means. Every door in London, every door they control," she corrected, setting down her teacup with deliberate precision. "Father, how many members of the Reform Club read the Morning Chronicle? What does that have to do with how many editors have you cultivated over the years? How many journalists owe you favors for stories about factory innovation and workers' conditions?" She lifted the Democratic Standard, the one paper her father kept despite its radical reputation. "How many people read publications the aristocracy pretends don't exist?" James Barrett stared at his daughter as understanding dawned, followed immediately by horror. "You can't fight a duke, not directly, not in their world." "You're right," Alissa said, and smiled the same cold smile she'd worn on the terrace last night. "So I won't fight him in their world." She rose from the table, gathering the scandal sheets like ammunition. "I'll build a different one, and I'll make sure everyone watches while I do it." Alissa stood at her bedroom window, watching carriages pass on Belgrave Square, and remembered the first time Lord Philip Kestner had spoken to her. Not at a ball, not during some calculated social maneuver, but in the reading room of the Reform Society on a Tuesday afternoon when she'd gone to research factory legislation and he'd been there doing the same. "You've underlined the same passage I did," he'd said, leaning over her shoulder to peer at Owen's treatise on cooperative labor. "The part about shared prosperity, creating social stability rather than threatening it." She turned, startled to find a gentleman in expensive tailoring reading radical economic theory in a room full of merchants and journalists. Philip had smiled with the particular enthusiasm of someone who'd finally found a conversation partner who understood what he was trying to say. "My brother thinks I'm wasting my time with this," he'd continued, gesturing at the stack of reform pamphlets. "He says aristocrats who concern themselves with workers' welfare are traitors to their class." "And what do you think?" Alissa had asked. "I think a class that requires betrayal to achieve basic human decency deserves to be betrayed." They'd talked for 3 hours that day. About Chartism and factory conditions, about inherited wealth and earned respect, about whether change came through legislation or revolution. Philip pursued every subsequent meeting with the intensity of someone starved for intellectual companionship, showing up at charity committee meetings Alissa attended, requesting her opinions on parliamentary debates, asking if she'd read the latest essay in the Westminster Review. It was Philip who'd invited her to the Huntington ball. Philip who'd insisted she meet his brother, believing naively that Edward would share his enthusiasm for a woman who understood economics as well as etiquette. Alissa had seen Edward's calculation the moment they were introduced. The way his eyes had moved from her face to Philip's expression, measuring the depth of his brother's attachment. The way he'd asked pointed questions about her father's business, her mother's absence, dead in childbirth, Alissa had explained, her education, her prospects. Not conversation, but interrogation. "My brother mentioned you've been reading Owen," Edward had said, his tone suggesting he'd found evidence of sedition rather than scholarship. "Lord Philip is kind to discuss ideas with someone outside his usual circles," Alissa had replied carefully. "Kind," Edward had repeated, and the word became something dangerous in his mouth. "Yes, Philip has always been susceptible to kindness. It's one of his more problematic qualities." She'd understood then what she was to Edward. Not a person, but a threat. Not a potential sister-in-law, but a variable that disrupted his control over the family fortune. If Philip married, if he gained independence through the Duchess's will, Edward would lose the absolute authority that defined his existence. 2 weeks later, she'd received a private letter from Edward requesting a meeting. She'd declined. 1 week after that, he'd appeared at her father's warehouse unannounced, offering her £5,000 to end her friendship with Philip, quietly. "I'm not pursuing your brother," she'd said. "I know," Edward had replied, and his honesty was more chilling than any accusation. "But he's pursuing you, and the result is the same. You're a complication I'm prepared to eliminate. By paying me to disappear? By whatever means prove necessary." She'd refused the money, walked away from the meeting believing Edward's threats were aristocratic bluster. She hadn't imagined he'd prefer public destruction over private negotiation, that he'd sacrifice his brother's happiness and her reputation rather than tolerate a shift in power. But Edward had always been willing to destroy anything that threatened his control, including Philip's trust, which Alissa realized now had been Edward's target all along. The accusation wasn't meant to ruin her. It was meant to teach Philip that defying his brother came with consequences, that caring about the wrong people invited catastrophe. Alissa turned from the window, her reflection ghostly in the glass. Edward had underestimated her, believing a ruined reputation would force retreat. He hadn't considered that destruction might free her from the need to be careful, that losing everything left her with nothing more to lose and therefore nothing constraining what she might dare to attempt. Philip would discover the truth eventually. But first, Alissa needed to ensure there was something worth discovering her for. A world where Edward's power couldn't rewrite reality with a single sentence. Where brothers didn't have to choose between family loyalty and justice. She sat at her writing desk and began composing her first letter. Not to Philip, not yet. To Thomas Whitmore, editor of the Democratic Standard, offering him something no other paper would print. The truth about how aristocratic power protected itself and what happened to those who threatened it. The offices of the Democratic Standard occupied 3 cramped rooms above a printer's shop in Clerkenwell, far from the marble-columned newspaper headquarters of Fleet Street. Alissa arrived without announcement on a Wednesday morning, knowing that men like Thomas Whitmore didn't keep appointment calendars because people who mattered didn't visit reformist newspapers voluntarily. She climbed the narrow staircase past the mechanical thunder of printing presses, the ink-heavy air thick enough to taste. A young clerk looked up from his desk with the exhausted expression of someone accustomed to complainants, creditors, and government officials bearing censorship threats. "I'm here to see Mr. Whitmore," Alissa said. "He doesn't take meetings without—" "Tell him Alissa Barrett is here. He'll know the name." The clerk's expression shifted from dismissal to sharp curiosity. He disappeared through a doorway, and Alissa heard urgent voices, then footsteps approaching with purpose rather than courtesy. Thomas Whitmore was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 40, with ink stains on his cuffs and the particular intensity of someone who'd built influence through words rather than inheritance. He studied her with the assessment of a journalist who'd learned to distinguish performance from truth. "Miss Barrett," he said, not offering the customary pleasantries about weather or health. "The woman every scandal sheet in London is discussing, but none are allowing to speak. I confess I'm surprised you came here, rather than issuing denials through the Morning Post." "The Morning Post wouldn't print my denial," Alissa said. "And if they did, it would appear on page 7 between advertisements for tooth powder and notices of estate sales. You, however, would put it on the front page." "Would I?" Whitmore's expression revealed nothing. "And why would I give valuable space to a society scandal?" "Because it's not a scandal. It's a case study." Alissa removed a leather portfolio from her bag, placing it on his desk with deliberate care. "You've written extensively about how aristocratic privilege distorts justice, how inherited power protects itself through reputation and rumor. I'm offering you proof." Whitmore opened the portfolio, scanning the documents inside. Letters from Philip discussing social reform. The invitation to the Huntington ball in Philip's handwriting, not hers. Her father's business records, showing the family's financial independence. The record of Edward's attempted bribe, corroborated by her father's clerk who'd witnessed the warehouse meeting. "This proves you didn't pursue Lord Philip," Whitmore said slowly. "It doesn't prove the Duke fabricated the accusation maliciously." "Not yet," Alissa agreed. "But it establishes that I had no financial motive. I didn't need the Kestner fortune. My father's worth more than most minor aristocrats combined. It raises the question of why the Duke would publicly destroy someone who posed no actual threat to his brother. Unless you posed a different kind of threat." "Exactly." Alissa leaned forward, her voice dropping to the register of shared conspiracy. "The Duke of Ravenscourt doesn't fear fortune hunters, Mr. Whitmore. He fears loss of control. I'm offering you the story of how aristocratic power operates when threatened, not through law or reason, but through the casual destruction of anyone who dares exist outside their approval." Whitmore studied her with the same careful attention he'd given the documents. "You understand that publishing this will make you more notorious, not less. The aristocracy will despise you for going to a reformist paper. They'll call it proof of your unsuitability." "They already despise me," Alissa said. "The question is whether the rising merchant class, the professional class, the thousands of people who read your paper and who've also learned that aristocratic approval is neither achievable nor worth achieving, whether they'll see my story as one-woman scandal or as evidence of a system that requires dismantling. And if I publish this, you'll give me exclusive access to whatever you discover about the Duke's motivations." "I'll give you something better," Alissa said. "I'll give you the story of what happens when someone fights back. Not through lawyers or proper channels, but through the same tool the Duke used against me, public opinion. Except I'll aim mine at people who understand that reputation should be earned, not inherited." Whitmore smiled then, the expression of a man who'd just recognized an unexpected ally. "Miss Barrett, I believe we have the beginning of a very interesting partnership." "We have the beginning of a war," Alissa corrected. "I'm simply choosing better generals this time." Alissa walked through the main floor of Barrett Textiles on Monday morning wearing a navy walking dress chosen for practicality rather than fashion, her hair pinned severely back, her leather portfolio tucked under one arm. The factory floor fell silent as workers recognized not the owner's daughter who occasionally toured with her father, but someone who carried herself with the authority of ownership itself. Her father had offered her the business arrangement 2 days after the scandal, speaking with the careful delicacy of someone proposing an escape rather than an opportunity. "You could take a formal position," he'd said. "Managing director, perhaps. Give people something to discuss besides the Duke's accusations." "Not managing director," Alissa had replied. "Partner, with my name on the letterhead and my signature on the contracts. I want everyone to know exactly who's responsible for what comes next." Now she stood before the assembly of floor managers, pattern cutters, and master weavers who'd spent decades perfecting their craft under her father's direction. Men who'd taken orders from James Barrett without question, but who regarded her with the particular skepticism reserved for women who claimed authority in spaces built for masculine expertise. "Gentlemen," she began, and her voice carried the same controlled precision she'd used in ballrooms where one wrong word could end a conversation. "For the past 3 years, I've been analyzing our production costs, waste ratios, and market positioning. You've implemented my suggestions because my father presented them as his own. That arrangement ends today." She opened her portfolio, distributing copies of a detailed proposal. "Our current profit margin is 18%. Within 6 months, I intend to increase it to 25% while simultaneously reducing worker hours and increasing wages." The head weaver, a man named Harrison, who'd worked for her father since the factory's founding, looked up from the proposal with undisguised skepticism. "That's mathematically impossible, Miss Barrett. You can't decrease costs and increase wages. You can if you eliminate waste that exists because we've always done things a particular way." Alissa moved to the large planning board, sketching modifications to the factory floor layout. "We're losing 4 hours per day to workers moving between stations that should be adjacent. The pattern cutting department rejects 12% of fabric due to measurement errors that could be prevented by standardizing templates. We're paying premium prices for dyes we could produce in-house at half the cost." She continued through 17 specific innovations, each supported by calculations she'd been compiling in the margins of social calendars and between charity committee reports. The reorganization of machinery that would reduce production time by 30%. The standardized sizing system that would allow faster pattern creation. The vertical integration of dye production that would eliminate dependence on suppliers who raised prices seasonally. "The quality that made you call me calculating when applied to marriage," Alissa said, watching recognition dawn on Harrison's face, "is the same quality that will make Barrett Textiles the most profitable manufactory in London. The difference is that society punishes women for being strategic about their futures but rewards them for being strategic about commerce, as long as they're willing to claim the credit publicly." Within 3 months, the changes were implemented. Within 5, profits had increased by 42%, and Barrett Textiles had secured contracts with 3 major retailers who'd previously dismissed James Barrett as capable but unexceptional. Within 6 months, Alissa's name appeared in the Times business section, in The Economist's analysis of industrial innovation, in Manchester trade journals that praised her methods without once mentioning the Huntington Ball scandal. The same people who'd crossed the street to avoid her now found themselves explaining to their husbands why they'd declined partnership with a woman whose business acumen was generating returns that made aristocratic land rents seem quaint by comparison. The Democratic Standard, ran the story with a headline that made Whitmore's position unmistakable. Miss Barrett proves strategic thinking depends on context, genius in commerce, scheming in marriage. Edward D. Kestner, reading the article in his Mayfair study, understood for the first time that Alissa Barrett had not been destroyed by his accusation. She'd been freed from the need to be acceptable, which made her infinitely more dangerous than when she'd been trying to belong. The letters arrived at the Democratic Standard's offices in a plain envelope with no return address, delivered by a messenger who disappeared before anyone thought to ask questions. Thomas Whitmore spread them across his desk with the careful attention of someone handling potential evidence or potential forgery, aware that either possibility carried consequences. 3 letters, allegedly written by Alissa Barrett to Lord Philip Kestner, each expressing calculated interest in his fortune and social position. The letters Edward had referenced at the Huntington ball, the proof that had made his accusation credible enough to destroy her without requiring further examination. Whitmore read them twice, then called for his assistant. "Get Miss Barrett here immediately." Alissa arrived within the hour, her expression shifting from curiosity to cold fury as she examined the documents. "These aren't my letters," she said, though her voice carried no surprise at the forgery itself, only at seeing the actual evidence of Edward's calculation. "The handwriting is similar, but look at the dates." She pointed to the first letter, dated September 14th. "This claims I wrote to Philip from Bath, describing my visit to the pump room and expressing interest in meeting him at the autumn assembly. I was in Manchester on September 14th, touring cotton mills with my father. We have hotel receipts, factory visitor logs, a published interview in the Manchester Guardian, where I discussed manufacturing innovations." The second letter, dated October 3rd, referenced a conversation allegedly held at the Royal Opera House. "I've never attended the opera," Alissa said flatly. "My father considers it an expensive waste of time, and I was raised to share his practical views on entertainment. Philip knows this. We discussed it during our first meeting when he mentioned seeing Don Giovanni." Whitmore studied the letters with growing recognition of what he held. Not merely forgeries, but careless ones, written by someone who'd assumed documentation would never be challenged because aristocratic word carried sufficient authority without requiring material proof. "The third letter mentions your modest circumstances," Whitmore noted. A strange phrase for someone whose family holdings are documented in multiple trade publications. "Edward needed me to be desperate," Alissa said. "The narrative only works if I'm a fortune hunter." A woman of independent means pursuing his brother for intellectual companionship doesn't threaten Philip's judgment. It threatens Edward's justification for intervention. The Democratic Standard published the inconsistencies with surgical precision, comparing the letter's claims against documented evidence of Alissa's whereabouts, verified through hotel records, factory logs, and published interviews. The article included statements from witnesses who'd seen her in Manchester during the period she'd allegedly been in Bath, from opera house staff confirming she'd never purchased tickets, from handwriting experts noting subtle differences between the forgeries and her actual correspondence. London's aristocratic society dismissed the article as expected defence from a reformist paper defending one of their own, but Philip Kestner, reading the analysis in his brother's library while Edward attended Parliament, felt the first crack appear in the certainty that had sustained him since the Huntington ball. He'd believed Edward because brothers were supposed to trust each other, because the alternative meant acknowledging that the man who'd raised him after their mother's death was capable of systematic deception. But Philip had been to Manchester with Alissa. He remembered her describing the cotton mills, remembered her frustration with the opera's impracticality, remembered her fierce independence that had attracted him precisely because it contradicted every assumption about women seeking aristocratic marriages. Philip returned the article to its place on Edward's desk, his hands shaking slightly as understanding transformed into something colder and more dangerous than doubt. His brother had provided letters as proof, letters that documented impossible events and revealed motivations Alissa had never expressed. which meant Edward had manufactured the entire scandal, had stood before 300 witnesses and lied with the confidence of someone who'd never faced consequences for lying, had destroyed an innocent woman because her existence threatened his control. Philip walked to Edward's private study, the room where family documents were kept. Where their mother's will resided in a locked drawer Edward had never allowed him to examine. He picked the lock with a letter opener, his Harvard legal training finally proving useful for something beyond disappointing his brother's expectations. The will confirmed what he'd begun to suspect, that his marriage would trigger financial independence. Edward had spent 5 years preventing that Alissa's destruction had been strategic preservation of power rather than brotherly protection. Philip closed the drawer, his decision crystallizing with the same clarity that had once drawn him to Alissa's conversation. Edward had taught him that family loyalty meant absolute obedience. Alissa had taught him that loyalty meant truth. He knew which lesson deserved his allegiance now. Edward arrived at Barrett Textiles without announcement on a Tuesday afternoon, his carriage conspicuous among the delivery wagons and workers' carts. He climbed the stairs to Alissa's office with the measured steps of someone accustomed to being admitted anywhere. Though his presence in a factory office represented the first time he'd entered her territory rather than summoning her to his. Alissa looked up from the production report spread across her desk, her expression registering neither surprise nor welcome. "Your Grace," she said, not rising, not offering the customary courtesies that might suggest he held authority here. "I wasn't aware we had an appointment." "We need to discuss a resolution," Edward said, closing the door behind him with the assumption of privacy that came from never being refused. He placed a leather document case on her desk. "I'm prepared to issue a public correction, a statement clarifying that the accusations at the Huntington Ball were based on incomplete information, that I acted hastily in my concern for my brother's welfare." "How gracious," Alissa said, making no move to open the case. "In exchange, you will accept this settlement, £50,000, and relocate to the continent. Florence has a thriving expatriate community. Vienna, if you prefer. Somewhere you can establish yourself comfortably, away from the complications of London society." Alissa leaned back in her chair, studying Edward with the same analytical attention she applied to factory efficiency reports. "You're offering me money to disappear after you've already tried to destroy me." "That suggests desperation rather than generosity." "It suggests pragmatism," Edward corrected. "You've proven more resilient than anticipated. Your business success has made you visible in ways that complicate the narrative. A quiet resolution serves both our interests." "Does it serve Philip's interests?" Alissa asked. "Or does it simply preserve your control over him?" Edward's expression remained carefully neutral, but his silence confirmed what Alissa had already deduced. She opened her desk drawer, removing a document she'd obtained through means she had no intention of explaining. A copy of the Duchess of Ravenscourt's will, with the relevant clause marked in red ink. "Upon the marriage of Lord Philip Kestner to a woman of good character and independent means," she read aloud, "the estate shall be divided equally between the Duke of Ravenscourt and Lord Philip Kestner, with Philip receiving full control of his portion." She set the document on her desk between them like evidence at trial. "You didn't destroy my reputation to protect Philip from a fortune hunter. You destroyed it to prevent him from gaining independence, because a woman of good character who possesses independent means would trigger the clause your mother designed specifically to free Philip from your control. My mother's will is a family matter. Your mother's will is the reason I'm sitting here with a ruined reputation instead of planning a wedding," Alissa interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut through aristocratic presumption. "You fabricated letters, manufactured a scandal, and stood before 300 witnesses to lie because the alternative was losing absolute power over your brother and half the family fortune. Edward's composure finally cracked, revealing the calculation beneath the concern. "What do you want? Another 50,000? 100? Name your price for disappearing." "I don't want your money," Alissa said, standing now, meeting his eyes with the force of someone who'd stopped seeking approval and started demanding accountability. "I want what you tried to take from me. My reputation, my future, my right to exist in England without requiring your permission or Philip's protection. But more than that, I want to ensure you never have the power to do this to anyone else." "You can't touch me," Edward said, though his voice carried less certainty than his words. "I'm a duke." "You're a merchant's daughter with a scandal attached to your name. No one will believe—" "Philip will," Alissa said quietly. "He's already started doubting. It's only a matter of time before he discovers the truth about the letters, about the will, about everything you've done to maintain control over him. And when he does, you won't be offering settlements. You'll be defending yourself in Chancery Court." Edward picked up his document case, his movements rigid with barely contained fury. "You're making a mistake, Miss Barrett. Accept the settlement while it's offered." "No," Alissa said. "You made the mistake when you assumed destruction would silence me, instead of freeing me from the need to be careful. Take your settlement and leave. I have work to do." Edward left without the courtesies of departure, his footsteps echoing down the factory stairs with the particular rhythm of retreat disguised as dignity. Alissa watched his carriage disappear into London traffic, then returned to her production reports, her hands steady, her resolve absolute. Edward had offered her escape. She'd chosen war. Philip sat in his mother's sitting room, the one Edward had locked after her death and preserved like a shrine no one was permitted to enter. He'd picked that lock too, driven by the same desperate need for truth that had led him to the will, to the forged letters, to the systematic unraveling of everything he'd believed about his brother's protection. The room still smelled faintly of her lavender perfume, though 5 years had passed since the consumption took her. Her writing desk remained as she'd left it, correspondence half finished, a book of poetry marked at a page about mothers and sons and the complicated mathematics of inheritance. Philip opened the desk's hidden drawer, the one she'd shown him when he was 12, making him promise never to tell Edward about the space where she kept her private thoughts. Inside, he found her journal from the year before her death, the leather cover soft from handling, the pages filled with her precise handwriting. Edward has become what his father was, a man who mistakes control for love, domination for protection. He cannot bear the thought of Philip choosing his own path, making his own mistakes, becoming his own person. "The estate will be his prison if I don't act." Philip turned pages, reading his mother's growing concern, her careful planning, her hope that the will's clause would force Edward to relinquish the absolute authority he'd claimed after their father's death. "I've structured the inheritance to trigger upon Philip's marriage to a woman of independent means and good character, someone who cannot be bought or intimidated, someone whose presence will force Philip to imagine life beyond Edward's shadow. It's the only way to save him." The final entry, written 3 weeks before her death, carried the weight of prediction. Edward will fight this. He'll see any woman Philip chooses as an enemy rather than a sister. I pray Philip has the strength to see the difference between loyalty and submission when that moment comes. Philip closed the journal, his mother's words settling over him like judgment from beyond death. She'd known. She'd predicted Edward's response with the accuracy of someone who'd spent 20 years married to their father, watching power corrupt affection until control became the only language their family understood. He returned to Edward's study with the systematic determination of someone conducting an investigation rather than betraying family. The forged letters were locked in the bottom drawer, along with drafts showing Edward's handwriting practice, attempting to match Alissa's script. receipts from a forger in Southwark, notes outlining the fabricated narrative, the fortune hunter, the calculated seduction, the need to destroy her character before Philip's attachment became permanent, evidence of premeditation, of systematic deception, of a brother willing to commit fraud rather than share power. Philip gathered the documents with hands that no longer shook, because certainty had replaced doubt. Edward had raised him after their father's death, taught him Greek and Latin, funded his education at Harvard, introduced him to philosophy and law. But none of that generosity erased what Philip now understood, that Edward's protection had always been conditional on obedience, that love in the Kestner family came with the price of submission. Their mother had tried to break that pattern. Edward had responded by destroying the woman she'd hoped would complete her work. Philip packed the evidence into a leather case, the same type Edward had carried to his meeting with Alissa. He thought about confronting his brother privately, offering the chance for explanation, for reconciliation, for some path that didn't require choosing between family and justice. But he'd already made that choice when he picked the first lock, when he read their mother's journal, when he understood that protecting Edward's reputation meant abandoning every principle Philip had claimed to value during those Reform Society meetings, where he'd discussed justice and equality and the corrupting influence of inherited power. He'd talked about reform as intellectual exercise. Alissa had lived it as survival. The difference between them was the difference between philosophy and necessity, between debating injustice and experiencing it, between sympathizing with victims and becoming one. Philip left the study with the evidence secured, his decision crystallizing with each step toward the door. He would take these documents to Chancery Court. He would testify against his brother. He would trigger the will clause not through marriage, but through legal challenge, forcing the division of the estate by proving Edward's fraud invalidated his authority as executor. Edward had taught him that family loyalty meant silence in the face of wrongdoing. Their mother had taught him that true loyalty meant preventing harm, even when the harm came from people you loved. Philip chose his mother's lesson, knowing it would cost him the only family he had left, but understanding that some prices were worth paying for the ability to look at yourself without flinching. The Court of Chancery filled beyond capacity on the morning of November 12th, spectators crowding into galleries designed for half their number, journalists occupying every available seat, members of Parliament attending under the pretense of constitutional interest when everyone understood they'd come for the scandal. The case caption read, "In re, estate of Catherine Kestner, Duchess of Ravenscourt." But London society recognized it for what it actually was. The public dismantling of a duke who'd assumed his title placed him beyond accountability. Edward sat at the respondents' table with 3 barristers whose fees could have funded a small manufactory, his posture rigid with the particular tension of someone unaccustomed to defending rather than pronouncing judgment. Across the aisle, Philip stood alone, except for a single solicitor, the leather case containing his mother's will and Edward's fabrications resting on the table like evidence at an execution. Alissa sat in the public gallery beside her father and Thomas Whitmore, her presence technically unnecessary since the case concerned a state execution rather than her destroyed reputation. But everyone in the courtroom understood that her absence would have suggested shame, and Alissa Barrett had stopped performing shame the moment Edward forced her to choose between acceptance and survival. The master of the rolls, Lord Chancellor Pemberton, surveyed the courtroom with the weary expression of someone who'd adjudicated property disputes for 30 years, and recognized when a case transcended mere inheritance. "Lord Philip Kestner," he said, his voice cutting through the murmured speculation. "You petition this court to challenge your brother's execution of the late Duchess's will on grounds of fraud. That is an extraordinary accusation requiring extraordinary evidence." Philip rose, his hand steady as he approached the bench. "Your Lordship, I present my mother's will, executed 5 years ago, which contains a specific clause requiring division of the estate upon my marriage to a woman of good character and independent means. I further present evidence that my brother, Edward Kessner, Duke of Ravenscourt, systematically fabricated accusations against Miss Alissa Barrett specifically to prevent the triggering of this clause, thereby maintaining fraudulent control over assets he was required to divide. He placed the documents before the court, the will, the forged letters with their documented impossibilities, the drafts showing Edward's handwriting practice, the receipts from the Southwark forger, the timeline proving Alissa's whereabouts contradicted the letter's claims. "These are serious allegations, Lord Philip," Pemberton said, scanning the evidence with increasing attention. "You accuse your brother not merely of poor judgment, but of deliberate fraud against your mother's estate." "I accuse him of destroying an innocent woman's reputation to preserve power my mother explicitly intended him to relinquish," Philip said, and his voice carried the particular clarity of someone who'd stopped protecting family and started protecting truth. The Duke stood before 300 witnesses at the Huntington ball and publicly accused Miss Barrett of scheming to entrap me, claiming to possess letters proving mercenary intent. Those letters, which I present to the court, contain geographical and temporal impossibilities that any basic investigation would have revealed. Edward's lead barrister rose, objecting with the procedural precision of someone buying time to construct defense. "Your lordship, these allegations rely on circumstantial—" "The letters reference conversations that never occurred," Philip interrupted, his composure fracturing into something raw. "They describe Miss Barrett in Bath when she was documented in Manchester. They claim she attended the opera when she's never purchased tickets. They attribute to her words she never spoke, and motivations she never held, because my brother needed her to be a fortune hunter to justify his intervention." He turned to face Edward directly, no longer addressing the court, but the brother who'd raised him. "You taught me that family loyalty meant trusting your judgment, but you destroyed someone innocent because her existence threatened your control. You made me complicit in her ruin by making me believe I needed protection from her, when the only person I needed protection from was you." The courtroom fell silent with the particular stillness that precedes verdicts. Pemberton studied the evidence, then Edward's carefully neutral expression, then Philip's barely controlled fury. "Duke of Ravenscourt," he said finally, "you will answer these allegations under oath, and I warn you, this court takes fraud against estates with utmost seriousness, particularly when such fraud involves the systematic destruction of an individual's reputation to serve the executor's financial interests." Edward stood, and for the first time since the proceedings began, Alissa saw uncertainty in his expression. Not fear, not yet, but the recognition that authority derived from title meant nothing in a court that valued evidence over aristocratic presumption. "I acted to protect my brother," Edward said, his voice carrying less conviction than his words. "Then you will demonstrate," Pemberton replied, "how protection required fabrication, how brotherly concern justified fraud, and how your mother's explicit intentions became subordinate to your desire for absolute control. The court will hear your explanation under oath, Your Grace, and I suggest it be significantly more compelling than your current defense." The Huntington ballroom held the same 3,000 crystals, but this time Alissa counted them from a position of power rather than destruction. 6 months had passed since the Chancery Court ruling that forced Edward to execute his mother's will as written, dividing the Kessner fortune and ending his absolute control over Philip's life. 3 months since the court ordered Edward to issue a public apology in the same location where he'd delivered his accusation, before witnesses who would spread the correction with the same enthusiasm they'd spread the scandal. Edward stood where he'd stood before, but the green velvet coat no longer glowed with righteous authority. He looked diminished somehow, not physically, but in the particular way powerful men shrink when forced to acknowledge that power has limits and consequences. "I stand before you," he began, his voice carrying the mechanical precision of court-mandated contrition. "To correct statements I made in this ballroom regarding Miss Alissa Barrett. Those statements were based on fabricated evidence created to prevent my brother's marriage and preserve control over the family estate. Miss Barrett's character is beyond reproach, her reputation unjustly damaged by my deliberate deception, and I offer my profound apology for the harm I have caused." The silence that followed contained none of the hungry anticipation of that first accusation. This was the uncomfortable stillness of society confronting the fact that one of their own had been publicly convicted of fraud, that aristocratic authority could be challenged and defeated, that titles provided no immunity from accountability. Alissa stood near the terrace doors, positioned deliberately where she'd stood the night Edward destroyed her. Philip stood beside her now, not touching, but present, offering solidarity rather than protection, because Alissa had proven she required neither protection nor permission to exist in spaces that had tried to exclude her. Edward descended from the center of the floor, approaching her with the rigid movements of someone completing an obligatory task. "Miss Barrett," he said, his voice low enough that only she and Philip could hear. "I hope this provides some measure of satisfaction and allows us all to move forward." "Forward?" Alissa repeated, and the word carried no warmth. "You want forgiveness, Your Grace?" "You want to frame this apology as closure so you can return to your life with your title intact and your conscience cleared. I've done what the court required. You've done what you were forced to do," Alissa corrected. "But I didn't fight this battle for your apology. I fought it to ensure you and men like you understand that reputation is not yours to destroy simply because you possess the title and the platform, that women don't require your approval to have value, that power must answer to evidence and truth, not the other way around." She glanced at Philip, then back at Edward. "Your brother and I are establishing the Barrett-Kessner Reform Society with the portion of the estate your mother intended him to have. We'll provide legal defense for those falsely accused by their social superiors, fund investigations into fraudulent claims made by titled individuals, and create systematic documentation that makes fabrication detectable and prosecution possible." Edward's expression hardened with recognition of what she'd built from his destruction. "You're creating an organization specifically designed to undermine aristocratic authority." "I'm creating protection against aristocratic abuse," Alissa corrected. "The difference is that you can't distinguish between authority and abuse because you've spent your entire life treating them as synonymous." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to the register of promises rather than threats. "You destroyed my name once, Your Grace. I've ensured no one will ever have that power again. Not over me, not over the women who come after me, not over anyone who lacks a title but possesses the audacity to exist without seeking permission from people who believe birth determines worth." Edward said nothing because there was nothing to say that wouldn't confirm her assessment. He turned and left through the main doors, departing the scene of both his triumph and his defeat, carrying with him the knowledge that Alissa Barrett had transformed his weapon into her shield and his cruelty into her cause. Philip watched his brother leave, then looked at Alissa with the particular mixture of admiration and grief that comes from loving someone whose destruction taught you necessary truths. "He'll never forgive this," Philip said quietly. "I don't need his forgiveness," Alissa replied. "I needed his acknowledgement that he was wrong, that I was harmed, and that such harm has consequences. Everything else, the society, the legal reforms, the systematic changes, those aren't about Edward anymore. They're about building something better." She turned back to the ballroom, to the faces watching with various expressions of shock, approval, discomfort, and calculation. The same faces that had turned toward her in condemnation now confronted the reality that she'd survived their judgment and emerged not begging for acceptance, but demanding accountability. Alissa and Philip left through the terrace doors, walking into the March evening that marked exactly 1 year since the original accusation. Behind them, the chandelier continued glittering with its 3,000 crystals, illuminating conversations that would carry her story forward. Not as cautionary tale about women who reached too high, but as evidence that the architecture of power could be challenged, dismantled, and rebuilt by those it had tried to destroy. The game Edward thought he'd won had indeed been just beginning. Alissa had simply been playing for different stakes than he'd imagined, not for restoration to the world that rejected her, but for the transformation of the world itself.